I'm Vince. I'm part of the VTU. I'm a member of the editorial collective of the Mainlander as well. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to do a little short introduction, do some housekeeping, and then I'll introduce these guys, or I'll let Sid introduce them. But yeah, we should begin, as is practice here in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland, to begin our proceedings with an acknowledgement that this event takes place on the unceded stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. We should also, take care to acknowledge that we are also hosting this event in the downtown east side. Here, always on the kind of like the shifting frontier of gentrification in Vancouver. The downtown east side has always been the heart of struggle in Vancouver and the Lower Mainland for Indigenous sovereignty, for working class power, for immigrant rights, and the right to housing. And if we want to talk about how do we decolonize beyond simple kind of like recognition or reconciliation, but address the necessity of redistribution, we do not need to look to the pipelines or the peripheries, but really here in the heart of the downtown east side, where, for instance, Oppenheimer Park has always been a site where, today there have been, there's 60 tents of folks, Indigenous and otherwise, trying to survive there, right? And every day, every week, they're being evicted. In 2014, there's a tent city there. It was declared Indigenous land, and the activists and the organizers at the tent city in Oppenheimer, they issued a eviction notice to the city of Vancouver. So if we want to pay attention to support the struggles of decolonization, it's right here in the heart of the city. We should always remember that when we're building our struggles and building our solidarity with Indigenous activists. So thank you for that. Again, I'm Vince. I'm here to, I'm going to be the hype man for these guys at the beginning, get everyone really excited. But to start, we'd like to thank the Ore Gallery, Denise Reiner, and the staff here, Lori and Asia, for graciously letting us this space to host this event. They've been very kind, and it's been really hard to organize this, so they've been very patient with us, so thank you to them. But I'll start with a very brief, short, and punchy introduction to why we're having this event today and the people on our panel. So, I'm going to start with a little personal thing. I came here to Vancouver about 3 years ago. It was I guess it was 2015-ish, 2016-ish. And I had moved here, I started working in Chinatown, and in 2011, the city had passed a historic area height review, some zoning policy, that made sure that, we're going to preserve certain areas, we're going to let other areas be turned into kind of like a condo park, right? And you'll see along Main Street, 2 gigantic condos. They rezoned it so there can be 15-story towers, right? They opened up in the same year that I moved here. And immediately, I got here and things started to change really quickly, right? The shops that served the low-income residents there in Chinatown, the elders there, started to shutter their windows and turn into boutique retail stores, right? So I got involved in organizing there. There was already a struggle raging on in Chinatown to protect people's homes, not just their apartments, but their livelihoods, their relationships, the worlds that they depended on. And it's kind of condensed in one fight called, it was around 105 Kiefer. Have you guys heard of 105 Kiefer? Yes, okay. More enthusiastic. Yeah. But you guys don't need me to tell too much about it, but that was a fight against Ryan Beatty. He's the loser billionaire developer, and over 6 years, a ragtag group of organized Chinatown tenants, elders, and youths were able to fight, five development applications to build a condo in the heart of Chinatown at 105 Kiefer. Yeah, we beat them 5 times, right? We slam dunked on this billionaire. And now it's an empty lot, right? But the struggle isn't over because he still owns it and he's still making money off of it. We're only going to win that fight once there's what the community has always demanded, 100% social housing for the seniors there. But that was a real victory, and that came from hard organizing. That struggle in Chinatown, that brought me to the downtown east side, to the Our Homes Can't Wait Coalition. The Our Homes Can't Wait Coalition, where I met Nat through Chinatown organizing, over there. Then Nate, I knew a little bit before that, but him and I, we're part of a larger coalition called the Our Homes Can't Wait Coalition. We came together in 2015 around the Carnegie Community Action Project's demand for 100% welfare and pension rate housing at 58 West Hastings. Have you guys heard of 58 West Hastings? Yeah, there you go. All right, so the fight there has been going on for 10 years. So we've been fighting for 10 years to build 100% welfare and pension rate housing in the center of the downtown east side. That has, people have fought long and hard for the site, and it's still an empty lot. Again, an empty lot. But the fight continues. The downtown east side has always come together with the folks in Chinatown to struggle for the right to housing, right? And it's not just shelter, but like real adequate housing that's community controlled, that's controlled by, not just the folks in the shelters that run shelters and prisons, but rather real community-based housing. And the struggle continues for that, right? Just last year, on May 1st, 2018, we staged a historic blockade of City Hall. Do you guys remember that? Yeah. Yes, okay, yeah. It was on the news. We got there before all the city councilors, before all the staff got in. We blocked the doors. I think a few of you were there, right? Yeah, some of you were there. And Sid was there, actually, and Sid got in a little tussle with the mayor. And because we blocked him from getting into work. And Sid and I have been working together at the Vancouver Tenants Union. And the Vancouver Tenants Union, it just got through its second year anniversary. They've been organizing tenants across the city, even outside the city, to fight for tenants' rights and tenant power, and through just like basic building blocks of organizing. That means door knocking, talking to folks, doing outreach, and making sure that landlords can't rent evict people from their homes, right? All I have to say is that there's a fight going on in Vancouver, right? And it's going not just in the downtown east side of Chinatown, which is kind of like the release valve for all the pressures that are happening around real estate all across the city, right? But we know that there's a bigger fight here. And the reason why the Vancouver Tenants Union wanted to bring Sam here, and while we're hosting this event, is because the way that we see the housing crisis in Vancouver, there's kind of like two scales, right? The first scale is very intimate. It's like, we're getting evicted from our homes, our rents are going up, we're thrown in a crisis, and we feel like really alone. And it's a kind of very intimate thing that's happening because this is your home that you're losing. On the other scale, we have something larger. There's a big process going on. We call it gentrification, but maybe we don't know exactly how it works, but we know there's a feeling, we see it happen every day, that our neighborhoods, entire blocks are being transformed into places that we can't recognize anymore, and maybe we can't afford, right? But there's something in between these scales, and there's a really important field, a technical field in the middle, and we call that urban planning. And that's why we brought Sam here, is start to understand planning as that middle term between the intimate violence of an eviction and this these large transformations, the displacements of gentrification. And we have to start to understand that technical field of planning is also a terrain of struggle. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And yeah, I'm going to pass it to Sid. And also, wait, one last thing with housekeeping. If people need to go to the bathroom, this is the back, to the right. And yeah, ask me if you have any questions. I'm going to tuck myself away a bit. But yeah, let's give them a hand.
We brought these people together because the point of this panel, as opposed to the one that's happening immediately afterwards, is kind of identifying power sources and then strategic action. So we really wanted to talk to people that are engaged in the struggles in the city. Nat Lowe, who's been engaged in Chinatown struggles, totally talked about 105 Key for a bit, and some other things about Chinatown. Nate Crompton, who's a historian and has been working in the downtown east side in the Our Homes Can't Wait Coalition, and Van Du, and Sam, who wrote a great book, which is right here, so go buy it if you haven't, or talk to Vince if you have no money. We can make it happen for you. Yeah, so that's why we brought these folks together. I kind of want to start off with a little tiny sentence from the book, which I think kind of sets the tone. It's near the end, and I think one great thing about this book is that it does focus on some solutions and some maybe sources for organizing. It says that radicals engaged in community-based planning must not bureaucratically manage class conflict, but rather accentuate it. A rowdy community planning process can help those excluded from the formal system develop a counter vision and organize around it. So I think we're here to talk about what that counter vision is and how to organize around it, and maybe some barriers along the way. I also want to echo what Vince said. We are on unceded Indigenous territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. And another good thing about this book is that it does center the fact that city planning or population planning around, food and resources and activities has always been something that's happened on this land. But the forced removal of certain populations is certainly like a western part of city planning. And that's something that settlers brought to this land. And I think that's something we need to center when we talk about city planning. So I guess maybe I'll talk a little bit about the VTU. So we started 2 years ago, as Vince said, and we're a democratic organization. I sit on the steering committee, and a lot of our fights kind of focus on organizing buildings, getting people together to fight against their landlords, and they're kind of funneled into the residential tenancy branch, the kind of like extra legal site where you go through arbitration and kind of cross your fingers. So that's kind of a lot of the work that we do. We were engaged last year in a motion going to City Hall that was supposed to end rent evictions. And I think that's maybe an interesting place to look at the language of city planning and how that kind of injects itself into our movements. So there's a new class of activists. I think we've seen like a lot of like the YIMBYs, the Yes in My Backyards, and people that are involved in city planning and have a lot of power with the city kind of inflect the conversation around the housing crisis. And these people know a lot about zoning, they've taken a lot of courses, and oftentimes they're people that the city will directly consult with about issues of gentrification or city planning and zoning. But kind of conversations about that can limit our possibilities. They can reframe what we want to see as human need, and when we talk about what we want and our vision for the city is always about human right to housing, and they can reframe that into a conversation around like zoning and specific city policies and kind of take away a bit of agency. And I think when we did that rent eviction, when we tried to push through all of that rent eviction motion back in November around City Hall, we kind of saw those processes really confuse supporters. It's really hard to reframe the language when what you're hearing from City Hall is all about what zoning certain laws apply to and what zoning it doesn't apply to. It kind of takes away from the struggle in that way. And then the other problem is that city staff then have kind of another process behind doors where city planners take what was won or what was not won and report back or obscure what's actually happening, what the actual processes are for implementing any wins. And I think we kind of see it like losing our ground in the democratic process through these kinds of mechanisms. So with that, I want to kind of ask a base question for Sam to respond to and kind of frame his book a little bit. And then Nate can reply. That is just, what is city planning and how does it factor into our movements?
Sure, thank you. What is city planning? It can mean so many things, and it often means a very specific and narrow thing. So in a bigger way, I think it's how we shape our spaces over time. So it usually is concentrated on physical space in the built environment, though it can also take on other issues of social policy. And it has that temporal dimension because it's about planning now what we want in the future. And so everybody does planning, everybody even does city planning who lives in the city, right? You make your own plan for how you're going to live in the future and what your space is going to be like to the extent that you have control over it. You do that in your person, in your household. Businesses are certainly making city plans for what they're going to do in the future, not only developers, but all sorts of private enterprises. Movements are city planners in the sense that they're figuring out what they want the shape of the city to look like and how it's going to impact their own community's futures. But then we have this sort of, so that's the expansive version of what city planning is or can be, including insurgent planning, as in planning from below, counter planning. But then we have this profession of urban planning, which is usually housed in government and usually housed in city government, specifically. It also includes, however, all sorts of consultants who are hired to help city planners, who are municipal employees, and also nonprofits and others who are trying to advocate and influence what the professional city planners are doing. So then there's this question of like, why do we have city planners in a capitalist society that likes to propose that the market sort of does it all itself? And the fact that all these capitalist cities have large municipal planning bodies kind of belies that ideology. So that's nice for us. It shows that markets actually demand a pretty high level of coordination of state infrastructure, things that the private sector isn't going to build out on its own, policing and military power, environmental regulation, all these things are demanded by capital in this sort of quiet way, right? They want to make it seem like they can do everything, but in fact they want the state to do quite a bit, and they require planners to coordinate all that action. There's also the management of space by race, which city planners all over North America and elsewhere have been kind of empowered to divide. So the idea is segregation in certain ways is required by capitalist development, and planners put in the building codes and the zoning and other land use regulations that encourage that separation. In the United States, that was made formally illegal in 1917, but then all sorts of other ways of producing the same result have been continued on. You also have planning as a force of coercion, state control over where we go and where we can't go, roads that are placed in certain places to channel people in one direction and not others, walls that divide, borders, etc. And the production of a rationality around that coercion, so that subjects of the state feel like this is natural, or this is desirable, or it just couldn't be any other way. So that's another role of city planning in capitalist cities. Another is to provide some of the functions of what we call social reproduction, which is how we ensure that people survive into the future to be workers and citizens. Capital will pay a wage, but it's never enough to ensure everything that people need to survive. They demand that the state, for instance, provide at least a bare minimum of education to have an educated workforce for future workers. Certain basic modes of mass transit and housing. In other times in capitalist development, there was a lot more emphasis on that. Obviously now there's a lot less. But still, capital demands that the state pick up some of the responsibility for ensuring social reproduction. All of this plays out in a very political way, where capital is making these demands on the state while simultaneously ensuring that the state doesn't go further than its profitability will allow. And so there's a constant tension there. And it plays out politically with different modes or different factions of capital making different demands on the state, and working class communities fighting for their own interests. And that's sort of like the long history of urban planning that we've seen in North America. A difference between this moment that we're living in now and some prior eras is that real estate capital is inordinately big and powerful and is forming not quite a monopoly on state planning interests, but something approaching it. Real estate is something like 60 or 61% of global capital at this point. So that's a huge amount of money channeled into real estate under the idea that land will become more and more profitable, there'll be more and more opportunities for new development, and property rates will go up. So they look to the state to ensure that, and specifically they look to planners to create the incentives for gentrification or the different modes of ensuring that gentrification happens in particular places. and that can include tax breaks and tax incentives, privatization of public spaces, deregulating rent control or ensuring that it doesn't come into place, corporatizing retail districts, rezoning to ensure development in certain places while protecting certain others, uneven distribution of public services to make certain places more friendly to capital and other places less so, and of course intensive policing to ensure that working class communities are made to feel uncomfortable and unsafe in particular areas. So all of that is how it plays out right now, but this is a terrain of struggle. Urban planning could be a very different thing under different conditions, and those conditions won't produce themselves. So showing a better idea for planning doesn't then make the planners act differently. There has to be like a pretty strong political movement to force them into that sort of action. So we need to be doing the planning ourselves in terms of determining what kind of urban future we want, and we need to be building up movements that throw the current system into the kind of crisis to which we can take advantage. That's me.
One of you wants it.
Cool. Okay, I'll go. Hi everyone, my name is Nat Lowe. I'm a community organizer in Chinatown. I've been lucky to have been involved in organizing with residents and recent struggles against gentrification in the neighborhood. I just want to thank the BTU and the Mainlander for hosting this conversation. I'd also like to thank Sam for flying all the way out here from New York to speak with us about his book, which is a very timely and needed analysis for working class movements today. Tonight I wanted to spend some time talking about recent developments in Chinatown, where we are now, and some ideas for how we can fight back together. As many of you know, 105 Kiefer was a huge victory in Chinatown. In 2017, working class residents and youth led the fight to stop Ryan Beatty, who is Western Canada's biggest industrial developer and landlord, from putting a 13-story condo in the heart of Chinatown, which put a damper on his foray into the residential market. What we didn't anticipate was how this victory led to the rise of Carol Lee and in the city and Chinatown power structure. Carol Lee, if you don't know who she is, she's the daughter of Robert Lee, one of Vancouver's biggest real estate moguls, philanthropist, and owner of Prospero International Realty. Her stated mantra for Chinatown is to make Chinatown great again. To do that, her vision for Chinatown is to make it Vancouver's #1 tourist attraction. So this strategy is essentially a strategy for cultural revitalization, or as Vince likes to call it, gentrification with Chinese characteristics. This is essentially a rebranding exercise. Through her charity, Chinatown Foundation, it's infusing millions of dollars of real estate capital into cultural revitalization projects, such as the Storytelling Center in Chinatown, a vintage clothing store, kind of hipsterized barbecue meat restaurant, and also is developing a social mix building at 58 West Hastings, which is part of the ongoing struggle for 100% social housing there through Our Homes Can't Wait. After being thoroughly embarrassed by the defeat of 105 Kiefer, City Hall supported this vision for culturally appropriate development through the creation of the Chinatown Transformation Team. This team is basically a cadre of urban planners with the goal of preserving heritage and culture through economic development. Many of them oversaw the very gentrification plans, such as the Historic Area Height Review, the Chinatown Economic Revitalization Action Plan, and a few others that I don't know the names of, that continue to threaten Chinatown residents today. Learning from their past mistakes, the transformation team has launched a participatory planning effort through recruiting community members to a Chinatown Legacy Stewardship Group. Their plan is for them to basically champion this vision for cultural revitalization. The group includes only a handful of residents, but is primarily dominated by groups aligned with Chinese capitalists, such as Chinatown Foundation, Success, and the Chinatown BIA. I think an important lesson that we can glean from reading Capital City is that gentrification happens in stages. Sam talks about investment, divestment, and reinvestment. Historically, for Chinatown, cycles of divestment and reinvestment are dictated by racial capitalism in the form of racist neglect or tokenized reinvestment. Since its inception, Chinatown was planned to contain the vice and unsanitary conditions of inferior races. During urban renewal, much of commercial Chinatown was preserved as a tourist destination, whereas thousands of actual residents of Chinatown and Strathcona were displaced. Hogan's Alley was decimated through the viaducts in 1972 as well. Today we see that cycle happening again with the same old planning tools of racial capital, and this time it's called cultural revitalization or intangible heritage or whatever else you want to call it. However, it never includes protections for tenants or social housing. Instead, it uses tools like public space interventions, pop-up markets, cultural activities that end up increasing property values because of the improved market image of the neighborhood. Meanwhile, without protections and permanent public housing, longtime residents get priced out of their homes. What's also clear from Capital City's analysis is that through industrial capital flight, real estate capital now plays an outsized role in forming and shaping city planning. Sam also theorizes that organized labor is the working class check on industrial capital, while organized labor is the working class check on industrial capital. Tenant and housing justice movements need to be the check on real estate capital. What we learned from 105 Kiefer was that mobilizing the same group of activists isn't enough. We need to build resourced, powerful, stable working class organization with a clear political line in order to combat real estate capital and gentrification planning. Now left organizers in Chinatown are focused on expanding our working class base primarily through class struggle organizing with the goal of connecting up tenants and broader neighborhood level fights. What is class struggle organizing? One example of this was organizing with Solheim tenants recently to get their elevator fixed. Their elevator was down for 7 months. Many of the tenants faced mobility issues, health problems, were elderly. 2 tenants passed away during the time that the elevator was down because they missed medical appointments. We heard stories of tenants walking upstairs on their hands and knees. On top of that, these challenges, the building was very racially mixed with Chinese, Latino, Black, and white tenants with many different spoken languages. And as organizers, we had to build relationships with tenants, identifying leaders, doing one-on-ones to build tenant solidarity. The first collective action that tenants took was to meet with a landlord. They created a list of demands, divided up speaking roles, and packed out the meeting room. The landlord didn't budge. The next thing that they did was put their demands into a letter and got a supermajority of their neighbors to sign it. At the following landlord meeting, tenants presented the letter on a big poster board with all the signatures. To the tenants' dismay, the landlord told them disappointing news. It would take them another 11 months for them to replace the elevator, and no monetary compensation would be offered, which was one of the main demands that tenants wanted. Immediately, tenants decided to take their campaign public through a multilingual protest in front of their building and invited the landlord to attend. The news was plastered all over the newspapers and TV. It was a big hit in Chinese media as well, where the CEO of Success, which is the landlord, Queenie Chu, was heavily criticized. 3 weeks later, the landlord met all of their demands. The elevator was finally fixed. Compensation was offered to all tenants in the building, not just tenants on the upper floors where the elevator reached everyone. They got a permanent full-time tenant support worker. They got their common room back, they got their bike room back, and the best part of it all is that tenants realized their power collectively. Now they're working to organize for the long term and building a tenant association. curiosity. What I think this example highlights is the power of class struggle organizing that builds multiracial solidarity for direct action. Tenants deliberately decided not to pursue a residential tenancy branch application because they knew that they wouldn't win demands such as getting compensation for all tenants in the building, including lower floors, and getting a full-time tenant support worker. We know that bourgeois government bureaucracies like the RTB are notoriously known to side with the landlords and are basically designed to manage tenant-landlord disputes. Instead, tenants continued to pressure the landlord success, knowing it was one of BC's biggest service nonprofits with a $45 million budget. Capital City talks about the need to scale up tenant organizing that wields withholding of rent through mass rent strikes as a way to put property capitalists into crisis. As a tenant movement, we need to scale this type of direct action class struggle organizing on a citywide and regional level. In conclusion, I believe that we are now living in revolutionary times, despite the rise of the real estate capitalist class. We are seeing waves of teacher strikes, student walkouts, mass civil disobedience across North America. Mass rent strikes are becoming a regular tool for tenants movements in cities like Toronto, San Francisco, LA, and New York. And in Vancouver, I believe the material conditions for revolutionary change is on the horizon. However, this is not going to happen by itself. As a tenant movement and as a broader working class, we need to seize the moment now.
What do you got, Nate?
That's good. I think thanks for having me. I think initial remarks probably be shorter, and then some longer comments, and some of the later questions. Just want to thank Sam for writing this book. It's an incredibly useful and exciting book. Some of our recent organizing with our Homes Can't Wait Coalition, it would have been helpful for us to have your book during our organizing. And in a sense, it's been a 10-year trajectory of organizing at 58 West Hastings. And in terms of the arc of the organizing, the moments or the times when our collective power has been diminished is in those moments when we're brought into contact with planners, and when we're kind of absorbed or sucked into a series of planning meetings. In a sense, you can read the history of the 58 struggle as this kind of rise and fall of autonomous collective organizing, followed by a kind of municipal state process of absorption into the local planning process. So each time we've gotten pulled into the planning process, it's been a way of neutralizing the demands coming from the community, with the long-term aim of dismantling and displacing our communities. The recent kind of denouement of the 58 organizing is that the planners have pulled a kind of coup and found a way to get their way with the plan, and in a lot of ways their success comes from this kind of combination of all these concepts in the book. So a kind of a particular model of social mix, or a particular version of inclusionary zoning, particular negation of the displacement effects of gentrification, and a particular strength of what you call the real estate state, and its ability to have kind of reverberations in terms of its messaging in the media, and a lot of sympathy for planners at that level. I think the neutral or somewhat expert, or the expert discourse of planners is a really important way in which they are able to plan, as you say, plan gentrification. And I think part of it is because the way that we often think of capital, or the way we think of the functioning of the housing market, it's often framed as this totally chaotic and unplanned thing, in relation to which planners are supposed to be the kind of corrective, and actually what's needed is a more sophisticated understanding, which you provide, of the way in which planning is itself indispensable for the process of accumulation, the coordination and regulation of the distribution of investment in urban space. And I think that's important, and social struggles are kind of developing their own theoretical framework, but I think this book is going to be additionally useful. So, thank you.
Chill. So I think before we talk about maybe some kind of particular instances of Vancouver that this brought up to me, I just kind of want to echo that when I think about the ways that planning has kind of shaped the narrative around struggle, like I specifically think about like sitting in City Hall when like the 105 Kiefer development got turned down for the last time, and knowing that there was this packed room full of people that had spent so much energy and time in organizing against the struggle, and then having it reflected back to you, and then telling you that it's just that the building doesn't look Chinese enough, and you know that that's not the case, is that like it's all people's like kind of like sweat and tears of what put into it, but that not only does that erase that struggle, but it also obviously leaves the door open for another development application, and one following the next. So I think that's why we really need to like harness this idea of zoning, and that it's really difficult to think about it and not just try to learn the language, reflect the language back, and speak in those terms to the city, but we really actually need to speak to the people that we're organizing in the working class and like the tenant movement instead. That's where the strength is, right? So on that, it's an interesting time for Vancouver, because this specific city council kind of came together to think one of the main issues with the city was that we didn't have a citywide plan, and now that they've passed a motion to actually create a citywide plan for the first time, and I'm not sure how many decades, I think it's the 60s or something, it's like a very long period without a city plan, so that's what they're focused on. And we kind of already know from things like Jean Swanson trying to insert into the plan a request to not have tenant displacement be a part of the city plan, and they didn't like that inclusion at all. That didn't pass into the general structure. That it's going to be a challenge to be able to articulate what our needs are and to offer a counter vision while this is ongoing, and to not see kind of all our efforts be kind of swallowed up into something that seems like it's kind of an academic top-down, like they know better, they know what the inevitability of the market is, they know exactly how the city works, and we don't know how it works. And that's kind of, I think, part of what's worrying. So, I mean, Nat talked a little bit about, well, you talked a lot about scaling up. You got some good ideas. You won a great fight. But I want to talk a little bit more about maybe what it means between when we at the VTU go through a process of organizability and getting to the RTB in a lot of instances. Like, we know that that's a really narrow struggle for what the possibilities of a tenant movement are, and I think right now our challenge for the next few years is going to be how to connect those struggles together and to do things like challenge a citywide plan and to articulate our own vision. So I think that's what I want to hear about. And I think maybe Sam also talked a little bit in the book about alternative models for community consultation and creating plans, and I'm like really interested in learning some more about that too. Yeah. Who wants to take it?
Just about the capital plan, or
Yeah.
I could be brief. I think that it's true, kind of the way that Vince opened the question, which is that the local dynamic of like evictions is kind of lived reality that then somehow fails to get attached to an abstraction of, say, capital or capital city. So part of it is the education work that the Tenants Union is doing around these larger dynamics. I think there is these emerging kind of networks of organizational affinity or citywide kind of efforts. I think that a lot of the legacy or a lot of specifically the downtown east side organizing is so strong and has such strong traditions of community organizing that there's a kind of self-sufficiency or a certain type of autonomy. But at the same time, what's emerging is larger citywide organizing. It's just been indispensable. So now the question is how to link together and form some kind of like tenant federation that, well, it is the tenants union but to start scaling up, like I said, I think in these larger terms of the abstractions of capital. And inevitably, I think that's going to lead us to these questions, to what are sort of electoral questions or questions of how to take power or dual power or something at the city council level. And I think that's been the trajectory with the emergence of Team Gene out of non-electoral organizing, say for the last 10 years. And I think that's I think in a lot of ways the book makes an argument for that. And I do think that's a necessary, like, essential aspect. At the same time, we'll have to make sure of avoiding the pitfalls of the electoral dynamic and all of the opportunism and all of the cutting of corners and social democratic picking of low-hanging fruit and all of the problems that come with elections. So I think our strategy should be remain at a distance from the state, while at the same time recognizing the strategic importance of the electoral strategy.
Is there anything that you can glean from? I mean, I know because the downtown east side is one of the areas that's had a city plan before, and those areas are really distinct in the way that capital is has flocked to them, and the
Right.
differences in land values and areas compared to other parts of the city.
Right.
Is there anything from that process?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a sense, the downtown east side experience is somehow like the archetype where it should be seen as the testing ground for a lot of these ways of local capital strategizing and both absorbing political responses and local resistance, but also managing profitability at a higher level. And I think that the way in which the downtown east side local area plan has sort of very strategically carved up the downtown east side in particular sub-areas with slightly different zoning regulations and upzoning and downzoning is on the one hand like a blueprint for how the larger city plan is probably going to look. And so what that means is basically privileges and protections for white middle class and basically single-family dwellings, and no protections for low-income and social housing. And the racial dynamic that already works within the downtown east side local area plan, particularly the racialization of the Strathcona plan, which is the downzoning and protection of the single-family units there versus the upzoning or deregulation of Stamps Place social housing. That racialized dynamic, I think, is going to play out in the city more generally. So you're going to see, unless we are able to sufficiently respond at a citywide level, you're going to see that same dynamic with the East Vancouver versus West Vancouver, the kind of like the racialized and class-based planning mechanisms at a citywide level. So I think downtown east side is a place to look at how that has played out, and as a kind of case study.
Yeah. Also, can you maybe just do a quick definition of what zoning is?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Zoning is kind of land use regulation about what can be built where that the city sets up. In most cases, it regulates two things: use and bulk. Use meaning what kind of use can happen in a particular plot of land, and bulk meaning how big, meaning wide or tall or whatever the buildings can be. So that's often the main land use regulation that planners use, and they use it to do everything else. So they will upzone, or meaning increase the development capacity, or downzone, meaning decrease what can be built there in the future as a means towards many other things. So that's zoning. I think the question of community consultation is really interesting and important. So before I talked about why capitalists demand planning in the first place, then there's this question of why should it even be a public process that we all have a say in? And a guy named Richard Vogelsong wrote a really great book about this about 30 years ago called Planning the Capitalist City. And he talks about the contradictions of urban planning. And the first one is the property contradiction. That's kind of what I talked about before. Capital needs a certain amount of planning, but also bristles at being told what to do. The second one is what he calls the capitalist democracy contradiction, which is in a formal democracy, a bourgeois democracy, urban planning needs to be open enough to the public that it maintains credibility, while closed enough that capital still gets what it demands out of the process. And in my words, I'd say planners must proceed with enough openness and transparency to maintain public legitimacy while ensuring that capital retains ultimate control over the processes' parameters. ... Public processes are open but rigged. They're open to our participation, but the dynamics of them are fairly closed. So then we get this whole kind of world of participatory planning, which can include design charrettes, they can include public planning commissions where non-elected residents are given the power to vote to approve or deny city plans, and that has become a terrain of struggle over the years. One way that local groups and working class groups have sort of fought to take over this system is through community-based planning. Communities get together, make their own plans, and then try to find a formal mechanism to force the state to make that the formal plan that's been instituted. And that's a really powerful process, but it's also potentially dangerous because it can use up a lot of time and effort and produce a thing that is then not necessarily implemented. Frances Fox Piven wrote really well about this in the early 1970s. And there's a quote from her writing in the book. She was trained as an urban planner and worked in New York City as a planner and then kind of got mad and became the brilliant theorist that she is. So her analysis, which sounds like a lot of her other analysis but applied to city planning, is this. Involving local groups in elaborate planning procedures is to guide them into a narrowly circumscribed form of political action, and precisely that form for which they are least equipped. What is laid out for the poor when their advocate arrives is a strategy of political participation which, to be effective, requires powerful group support, stable organization, professional staff, and money, precisely those resources which the poor do not have. The absorbing and elaborate planning procedures which follow may be effective in dampening any impulse toward disruptive action, which has always been the main political resource of the very poor. So she's arguing that it's a trap. It takes people's time and it channels them into the kind of work which they are least likely to be successful in doing. But I kind of agree with that, and yet I still think it's important. And it's important, for one thing, is in focusing our movements around what exactly we want, who we are and who we're against. And knowing that enables us to organize around that, but also to evaluate what the state is doing compared to our own principles and desires around space. So I still think it's important. There's something called the experimental nucleus of conflictual planning in, I think it's Sao Paulo, it might be Rio, it's in Brazil. And it's this kind of alternative planning school that starts with the premise that under capitalist production, planning is an essentially conflictual rather than consensus-based activity. It's about conflict, and we should be sharpening that conflict and fighting to win. Not fighting for, other people to see things our way necessarily. It's just not going to happen. So then it becomes a process of building up the kind of disruptive power that Piven is talking about in order to make our community-based plan the one that the state has to implement. I think what the VTU is doing now, I think
is good. I think they're building out a lot of chapter-based organizing, neighborhood by neighborhood. I think that needs to get scaled up. We need to do more of that. I think neighborhoods have their own power structures, like what we saw in Chinatown, and I think it's really important to organize on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. And I know that the BTU is putting some thought into potentially doing like an organizing training, and I think that's really valuable as well. I think the piece about the RTB and like versus class struggle organizing is an important one, in that I think the RTB can be like many legal processes. It can be very drawn out. It can take many years. It requires a lot of, I think, expertise about the process. And while I think the work of the BTU in doing the RTB advocacy work is super important and is at the end of the day necessary, I think we need to also be looking at building collective power in our organizing work. We need to do more of that, and we need to talk about that and build that into our trainings and make that more of a focus rather than kind of the legal side of it. And then one idea that I think I'd like to explore a little bit more is the role of organized labor. Like, organized labor is supposed to be the key structure of defense for the working class, and Sam talks a lot about kind of how industrial capital has organized labor is a check on industrial capital, but with industrial capital flight, real estate capital is kind of the big player in the game in cities now, and oftentimes labor unions in cities are a lot weaker. But they also, at least like the building trades and building trades unions also support that power structure, right? So I think for tenant movements, we have to try to figure out how we can get resources from organized labor, because they have a lot of resources. We need to be able to funnel those resources into our tenant organizing work, and we have to make them realize that, at the end of the day, if they win, wage increases, that's just going to get clawed back, right, from with rent increases, right? So union members are tenants are union members, and I think we have to figure out how to bridge that. And I know like last week we did, there was the Unite Here rally in downtown, and I know a lot of tenant VTU members went to that, which was really great. I think we need to do more of that. I'm hoping that unions will start showing up for the VTU things and tenant movement things as well, so we can, unite those key sections of the working class together.
Yeah, agreed on all fronts. I think what's one thing I think about, because we've been talking a lot at the VTU about the Broadway subway and the potential impacts for tenants along that line, and that we know that we're not imagining it, because we watch building sales happen, and we watch building sales, the kind of pitch to buyers, they often include details about what the rent gap is, which is in Sam's book. So the rent gap between current rents and potential market rents. So a lot of these sales are kind of predicted by what happens after you clear out the building and you get rid of the tenants. What's your possible income after that? And that happened a lot after that Broadway line was announced. We saw several buildings have that kind of sales add up. So I think one good thing that I think about is how we don't do a very good job, I think, of talking about what our vision is for land use necessarily, but obviously we do a good job of just saying that like displacement in any form is unacceptable, and that's a really good thing for us to focus on, and something that's not going to be included, and also actually has impacts on the way that capital moves through cities. So like rent control is a essential part of that fight back, and that it limits the power of capital in a certain respect, so it's really important. That's also exactly why they're going to tell us that if we get vacancy control, which is a kind of rent control, that means that you can't increase the rent in between different tenants, which we have been strongly advocating for, but a wide variety of people from, apparent progressives to obviously like the landlord developer lobby, to UDI, the urban development lobbyists, will say that we will get no supply and that it'll be bad for tenants at the end of the day, which is something that we can talk about, I think, a little bit more later. But I kind of want to pivot to another particular problem of Vancouver that I was thinking about throughout this book. So the book talks a lot about interlocking structures, international investment, and what international investment has a hold on the city, and what local political pressures of the real estate capital will use for the city to force its desire for land use. And I think we've talked a little bit about that tension today. So there's been a large public outcry over the last few years from political figures and the Twitter real estate analysis about the foreign investment, and a call for a public inquiry. And what I think is really harmful is that obviously these kind of outcries are often really nationalistic, and they also draw this line in the sand where all land use that is either foreign capital land use or someone locally selling to a foreign investor. So they draw this line between what's good and bad land use, and it's local and foreign. And that's, I think, a really strange way to look at it. I think one of the things in Sam's book, especially the Donald Trump chapter, which surprisingly was good. I don't know. I read Donald Trump's name and my eyes glaze over a little bit, but it's a really good chapter. It's just that speculation and displacement and dispossession are really natural parts of the real estate capital. Doesn't really matter where it's coming from, and that we really need to get a narrative around how that land use has been dictated by local actors and what the state's involvement in it is, and also what banks' involvements and international investments involvement is in that. And it's really difficult to cut through and say, obviously, that there is a speculation problem and that there's been things that have ramped up, but how do we talk about the actual issue of being, land use and dispossession, and not scapegoat or produce certain criminals, and then ignore the broader power structures. Because it frames it as if it's a market distortion. So if it's somebody with your local billionaires, your Ryan Beatty's and your Peter Walls, and it's not a market distortion. Those are local incomes for some reason. And then if it's a Chinese billionaire, that's not a local. It's a distortion of the market, and it's not a local income, which makes it seem like there's a natural state of the market that's good, and completely hides these power structures and how all of these local billionaires are also making our lives suck. So I want to talk a little bit about, is there a way that we can reframe now that there is going to be a public inquiry in our benefit? Is there a way that we can talk about this and make apparent the structures that are inherent in it for inhabitants of the city, to get, I guess, some resolve about what the bank's hands in it, what the city's hands in it are, what politicians' hands are, and trying to move forward using what the call-outs have already been to a place that's, I think, more just and already gets at our actual vision of housing as a human right. Does that make sense? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that answer.
But did you?
I'm sure I did, but
Okay. First of all, that was good. I liked that. I think that this, for better or for worse, this is going to be a central question for us. Whether we like it or not, we're being pulled into the debate, and I think that the launch the announcement of the public inquiry is a turning point, or it's a official or top-down kind of vindication of this kind of Twitterverse, like, you know, this like Twitter kind of whisper campaign, like highly anecdotal, very light on facts and information, kind of narrative about how the cause of the housing crisis is this external foreign element. I think that like in Sam's book, there is this kind of dialectic between, you know, the planner, the local state, and then this kind of international force. I think that in the kind of New York context, it seems a bit kind of like similar to like a large city like London or something, where global capital is like Saudi and like Middle Eastern and Asian and European. As a Pacific Rim city, I think in Vancouver, I think that we have a responsibility to really be careful about that framing, even though there's an important element of it, and to try to have a nuance in our analysis of it, and particularly understand the ways in which local forces, like already outlined really well by Sid, are central to the dynamic of the speculative housing economy. I think the role of VCs like homegrown millionaires or homegrown billionaires, whether it's the Aquilinis or whether it's, you know, these local forces that have, under a regime of neoliberalism and tax cuts and hyper profitability now since at least the 80s, those funds are being funneled into real estate, which is, you know, the highest returns, real estate being kind of the largest economy, both locally and internationally. The framing of so-called quote-unquote dirty money is highly dubious and questionable framing, and poses the question of what exactly clean money would look like in a context of mass evictions, mass displacement, evicted seniors, social and racial cleansing of the downtown east side of Hastings Sunrise. These are all played out by local forces and landlords and have been for decades. If they want, and I'll try to wrap up really quick, but I think really to understand the local economy as a headquarters of the global capitalist financial markets, natural resource markets, even tech markets and film industry, grasping the role of profits being recirculated in the local housing economy is central, particularly mining, right? Vancouver has 800 mining headquarters. It is the international capital, international mining, right? So David Eby has launched his inquiry into dirty money, and it's sad that he hasn't focused on the dirty money that has been this foundational for the local economy, and including, you know, the current dispossession, but also the foundational dispossession for the BC economy. And I had one last thing. So even though the inquiry is just getting kicked off, there has been a whole number of policy measures and speculation tax, empty homes tax, and all of these. And the BC Ministry of Finance just released a report stating that 99% of locals were given exemptions from the speculation tax. So our local Trumps, our local Bob Rennies are not paying this speculation tax, and it's become really clear that the purpose is targeting of a particular slice of the economy, which is the kind of racialized Chinese, particularly Chinese economy. But I think what's really important is the rate of the taxation, the 0.5, is incredibly small, and is not the cause of the recent downturn at all. The recent downturn is because for at least 2 decades, people, or at least since the mid 2000s, people have been waiting for the hyperinflated Vancouver economy to overextend and overheat, and we're in what the local real estate calls the death cross, and it's going to be a small downturn, and it was not caused by the 0.5, or it was not caused by the other measures. And I think that to really wrap up, to say that with the NDPs, I mean, the tax is incredibly low, and then B, local billionaires, millionaires, property owners, landlords, and developers are being exempt from that tax in a hypocritical, racist, double standard. That low tax is in keeping with the NDP's low taxes on personal income, low taxes on the business taxation, business tax rate, property transfer tax. All of these things under a progressive, quote-unquote progressive NDP government are the exact same rates as what they were under the BC Liberal government, under the Gordon Campbell government. So I think really what we also have to understand is that the rage, the class conflict, the class struggle, the class rage that's emerging is being noticed by the state, and they're in a kind of highly complicated process of trying to rechannel the rage, give a kind of quick explanation and blame the foreign role, but also to distract from their own inability and unwillingness to increase taxes, like I said, and have social expenditures, but also to implement the most basic things like rent control, close the rent control loopholes, and these other things which the VTU can speak to. And so I think that it's going to be really hard for us going forward to get our message out. And the process of substitution, empty condos means foreigner, high prices means foreigner, all these things, there's so much to unpack. So we have to persevere and be strong, and but it's really our organizing that and demanding rent control and making our concrete demands that's going to push the debate.
I don't know what to really say about this. I mean, yeah, like I think the foreign investor thing is, yeah, it's obviously racist and nationalistic, and it plays out in our organizing and our tenant organizing. I think, like for example, in mixed buildings where we have Chinese tenants and other tenants as well, I think there's often a perception that Chinese tenants are devious, or they're hiding their income, or they're wealthier than they seem, and it plays out, right, in how even in low-income communities, right? So I think that is definitely a struggle. I think for me, I really want to focus on organizing Chinese working class people. I think that's really important in being able to counter that narrative, building organization with Chinese working class folks. But also, yeah, we need to bust that myth. I think, like, I was looking at that public inquiry report where it talks about, where all the money's coming from, and it's like 78, I forget how much money it is, like 4.5 billion is coming from North America, and I think less than $1 billion is like coming from East Asia or something like that. So clearly, like, there's a racist double standard there. But yeah, like, we have to be critical of global capital and all capitalists, regardless of their nationality. So I think that's a difficult question, and I think that we need to continue to organize around that.
Those were great answers, and I don't have too much to add, but one thought that's coming to my mind is I just came from Seattle, so I flew to Seattle last week, and then I came here now, and then I'm going home next. And I mean, first of all, Seattle has been totally transformed by like Microsoft and Amazon, and so many of the same dynamics are taking place there, and it's two white U.S. citizen dudes, and it so like you see the same thing happening, but it isn't blamed in the same way. But then also the thing that everyone is talking about in Seattle right now is just the 20-year anniversary of the Battle of Seattle around the WTO. And so, what that taught us, if we didn't know it already, was that capital was global. And, the international working class was going to take on the international capitalist class, and that was going to be, the struggle of the future. Things went in a different direction, but we were still right. That is true. So if capital is global, then it's no surprise that some of the international some of the investment in our built environment is crossing national borders, because some of the investment in everything is crossing national borders. And of course, it's incredibly rich for North American cities to complain about foreign investment distorting their markets. Like, what is the entire history of the rest of the world in the 20th century and beyond, if not North American capital going to all sorts of other places and messing up markets in all sorts of other ways? So, I mean, what we can maybe take out of this is embracing the fact that it's obvious that capital is global, and maybe trying to build an international working class movement that is about tenants joining together across national borders, as well as unions and labor working across national borders. In New York City, yes, we have maybe perhaps a more diverse set of countries that are, or people from different countries who are investing in the built environment. We also had Paul Manafort doing this sort of thing, who was running Trump's campaign. And while he was running Trump's campaign, he bought a property in Brooklyn for $10 million that was probably worth $2 million, and was definitely laundering money through that, and got all sorts of loans based on the mortgage that he could get. So, like, it's a international pastime. It's certainly not something we can pin on one group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was talking to Nate the other day, and I think about just the fact that, like, in my organizing, I've completely kind of glazed over the impact of the city's credit rating, for instance, and that they care about that when they're designing policy and that kind of thing. I'm, like, interested in learning more about, and I think just, like, focusing a little bit more to kind of broaden and get a better understanding of who the enemies are, which I think is part of this. Yeah. So I'm gonna ask maybe another question, and then we'll maybe wrap it up and see if we've got some time for Q&A. Yeah. Okay, so there's a little section I want Sam to read, because you'll get the intonation, right? It's that first sticky note. It's at the end of the paragraph and then the next page.
Okay.
Finishing it. Yeah.
What's the last paragraph here?
Yeah, last paragraph and then just the next page.
Okay.
Yeah.
So this is, should I contextualize or just read it?
Yeah, just read it.
Okay.
We'll do it. Yeah.
Even as the market shows signs of stress, the push for development has not diminished. In fact, if the market tumbles, planners and politicians will likely respond by providing even more generous subsidies to luxury developers, since most of their planning strategies rely on a booming real estate market. They also know that under the right conditions, declining investment in property can become the precondition for future reinvestment and therefore gentrification. Such cycles cannot last forever, but for the last several decades, New York's planners and investors have managed to turn each near bust into another boom. That's the end of the chapter.
Okay, cool. So I think this has been a problem that has been concerning me a little bit, because I think about the fact that we're in, like, an apparent market downturn, which we know is kind of just the top of the market, and isn't really, it's not bringing down rents, obviously. But that is an excuse for the city to kind of double down on its policies of kind of developer giveaways, policies that they've been relying on. Like, I think if you looked around the narratives around Rental 100, which is like taking away any kind of community investments that developers have to give in order to build their buildings where they want to build them. It's just scratching that so that they build market rentals instead of condominiums. And we've been told a lot through our organizing that we might be pro-condos because we don't like this policy very much, which is pretty ridiculous, but it does kind of point to, like, the constraints that city planning puts our struggles into, and the fact that I think, as Sam points out in his book, that with the neoliberal shift, states, so like the provincial government and the federal government stopped investing in housing. They stopped building social housing. And so how the city has had to step in with their kind of limited budget is by resorting to these kind of developer kickbacks as the only way they could provide any housing within reach of even, like, kind of the higher kind of middle class incomes. Not that the middle class exists, but we'll talk about that after. And this is like something that I think is definitely like Gregor Robertson and Vision Vancouver's kind of raison d'etre. It's like that's what they do. But it's also what the new council does, because we heard last week, just like a couple weeks ago, our Mayor Kennedy Stewart say out loud that there was no policy that could help people make under 30 grand a year. Just nothing. And that's deeply upsetting, because I think as we kind of see this like market kind of downturn a little bit, that could be like the time where we're able to kind of invigorate demands for social housing, invigorate like more demands for our government to purchase apartment buildings and create permanent affordable housing, for rent control, for all these things. But instead, I think we're going to be sold even more so than we have been, that rent control is impossible because they'll never build another rental apartment again for anybody. And that we need to give away tax incentives to developers, otherwise people are going to go homeless because they have nowhere to live, that kind of thing. So I think, yeah, is there kind of a radical housing discourse that we can, response that we can give to market downturn? And I guess where is the place that we can describe our vision for the future is kind of my question. Yeah.
I'll give a quick response and then.
Sounds great.
I mean, we're often told that we can't do anything because of the opposite condition, that the land is too expensive and the property is too expensive, and therefore, like, it's too expensive to do anything good. And so, if that's going to be their line, and then there's going to be a downturn, then by their own logic, that should be the moment when we do all that great decommodified housing that we supposedly can't afford to do under current conditions.
Mm-hmm.
So that does mean that we need to be prepared for which form of decommodified housing we want to be pushing, whether it's state-owned public housing, whether it's community land trusts, whether it's limited equity co-ops, whether it's strict rent control. Like, what do we want? And looking also at mechanisms that cities have used to increase the stock of either public or decommodified land, whether that's eminent domain purchases were usually used for the wrong purpose but could be used for a better one. Tenant Opportunity to Protect Act, which they have in DC, which allows tenants to buy out properties and turn them into limited equity co-ops. The city's right of first refusal, which Paris has now, where the city has the right to buy a property before any private developer can buy it. All these things are like out there, and it's probably a good moment to plan for a future downturn and be ready with those strategies that you think are most appropriate for different areas.
I think that with the Rental 100, like, first it was STIR, short-term incentives for rental. I mean, it's been one of the biggest mechanisms for the public subsidy of private real estate industry. It's basically the way in which theoretically public land and public finances are transferred into the hands of private developers. I think that now it's really ironic that they're saying this in the way that Sam says, but it also shows, I mean, whether or not it's true, I'm not sure, because the business press is still talks about how rental housing is really hot, and the developers also talk about how 50 to 60% of condos are re-rented in the sublease market, which I think is relatively true. I think that honestly they're creating an opening for us, because they're showing that if the developers aren't willing to do even the most basic rental, mid-market rental housing, if they're not willing to do it without these multi-million-dollar subsidies, this would be a good time to rethink the neoliberal model where we have to rely on them for everything. So part of that would be through higher taxes on the developers, higher corporate income taxes, higher personal income taxes, and use that money to build non-market housing and buy land. And I agree with what Sam said about buying land. There's a lot of different models that we have to look at, and social movements and communities are really strongly critiquing the social control that comes with supportive housing model, and also Indigenous communities are experimenting with their own forms of development. And so if we're calling for the city to buy land, it should be now in a new decolonial or anti-colonial framework of decommodified land. And that's also a moment of possibility, I think. So.
Yeah, I'll skip that.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, I think I was just kind of, we've been talking about how the mayor has been kind of obsessed with this like margin of like 5% profitability for market rentals and how to possibly expand that. And a lot of city councils are kind of willing to do anything to bend over backwards to make sure that that increases and remains stable. And I think like Nate and I were talking a little bit about how often banks won't really finance condominium projects unless they have a 20% profit rate. So it's kind of interesting now that this conversation is happening where business press is reporting that now all they want to build is market rentals. But yet apparently we only have a 5% profit rate on market rentals, and
So
I think
so the mayor claims.
so the mayor claims. So it's a lot of things that I think if we are organized enough, then we can do a lot of calling their bluff. But we have to, really focus it on articulating what we want and what kind of decommodified housing we want. Yeah.
Oh, let's do a Q&A. But let's thank the panel. Guys, you guys are So what we're gonna do, we only have 15 minutes to do this. Sam's gotta go to another event afterwards. I'll talk a little bit at the end about what's happening afterwards, but let's try to keep the questions short and actually as a question. So starting with Alex, yeah, go.
Nat, I have a quick question about the unions. It's Nat, right?
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, you made a really cool point about BTU and Unite here. So my question is like QB 1004. Like I work with Portland Hotel Society.
Yeah.
And I'm super curious about like that's a really interesting thing because like I'm actually literally sometimes called like the henchman of the landlords because like they're landlords, but we just as landlords. So I'm just kind of curious about how QB what are unique can help. That's my question.
Yeah, like I think every union has democratic structures in which you can, as a member, pass resolutions, put forward resolutions. You yourself can run for leadership positions within your union. I think there's a lot of ways that unions, you as a union member can push for that. And a lot of unions have like social justice funds that they give money to a lot of nonprofit groups and things like that. So look into that, find out what they're doing, how much money there is available, how to access those things. Maybe your steward knows that kind of thing. And I also just want to say that the tenant support worker that Solheim Tenants won, I think is also part of your union too, QP 1004 as well. So, yeah.
Just say something just real quick about that, which is that my next book is going to be about unions and nonprofits under the conditions of the real estate state and why it's been hard to get them to actually oppose these things rather than negotiate the parameters of them. So look out for that.
We have to wait for a little while
It's
though.
going to take time.
Right, Chester.
So we have Roger, then Listen, and then whoever that is.
Sarah.
Sarah.
Yeah.
No, so Roger first.
So, Sam, you earlier talked about using the structures, even if we don't have a lot of faith in them, that exist. But very few of us have, a number of us applied to go on the city's renter advisory committee, and a couple of us were picked and the rest of us were not. Are there experiences, ways that can be kind of a gate, a way that mass movements can use that to express themselves? We try and do it in city council. I think we've been, had some successes in using city council because it is a public forum. But the communities are, we can be really cynical about what they are, but I'd like to be a little optimistic and say, are there experiences and can we think of ways that they could be another gate for us to use mass movements to express, what we need, what renters need.
Do you want to answer me to answer, or do you want to take more questions? Okay, so yeah, it's important, but it's dangerous, right? If you get involved in a thing and you lend legitimacy to it, but then you don't actually have a way to change it, then you haven't been doing other work while also making this thing that you're theoretically opposed to stronger. On the other hand, if you can either use your position on there to mess up the regular functions of it, or if you can gain enough seats on it to push it in a different direction, then it becomes a valuable resource. And that's where you have to weigh, in this particular case, whether those things are possible. We have these community boards in New York City, which are the most representative form of government, and their power on land use is entirely advisory. And so some people have joined them to try to change them and move them around, but they just structurally don't have the power to do anything. And so then a lot of people get frustrated and feel like they wasted their time. So each institution, you have to make a calculation about the potential good that you can do through them. That's it?
So I have a question. I'm glad everybody on the panel mentioned the public inquiry, because I agree that this is a turning point, although I think the MVP has already made that narrative hegemonic. So my question is about the working class composition, and this notion of accentuating class conflict. To me, the foreign investment narrative is clearly middle class anti-capitalism. It's kind of the professional managerial people who are going to work as urban planners or accountants for mining companies or whatever. This is people who want to own homes and feel they're entitled to. That's kind of their narrative. So my question is, how do we deal with, what people have called the labor aristocracy, or what I think we can boil down to right now is the kind of ideological effects of settler colonialism and the consciousness of groups of people who are technically working class because they sell their labor to survive, but also have a real material investment in home ownership and really in access to indigenous land. So my question is, what are your thoughts on class composition? Who are the protagonists of the struggle? And also, kind of as a corollary to that, what is the vision here? Is our best dream world scenario state-owned public housing? Because in my mind, where does that leave indigenous people? If we just want the colonial state to own more land, do we want to threaten private property and public property forms because it's colonial? So who are the protagonists? What's the deal with class composition? What's the kind of dream world thing that we're all really excited to do it on? It's going to inspire us to do all the reform nature.
Hot question.
I feel like I'll start with class composition a little bit. So we've been talking about kind of our tenants a class, and it's obviously complicated because I think the policies of the federal government and provincial government do everything possible to kind of uphold home ownership as the goal, and I think in a really classic traditional way as separating the working class into a middle class. I think it's pretty textbook the way that they play their interests off of each other, obviously. And I do wonder, I think because home ownership takes different forms and is available to different people depending on where you live in this country. So I often do wonder about the exclusion of homeowners, especially when you're talking about people who have mortgages and whether or not the bank is actually the owner of that property and that kind of thing. Obviously, we are an unceded land, so if you own a home here, you're stealing land. That's the central part of it. But how do we talk to people whose interests shouldn't be divided in that way? I think I was talking, maybe Nate can talk a little bit more about how that's been central, I think, to labor struggles and who strikes and who doesn't strike, and how mortgage holders, we were talking a little bit about how mortgage holders are kind of the most docile workers often because they have defaulting is a terrifying thing, and that kind of tends to take the sales out of a lot of class struggle.
I think that in terms of class composition, it's easier to speak of Vancouver, I guess. BC, it gets more complicated because this settler colonial dream of access to private property is slightly more accessible outside of the Lower Mainland. think within Vancouver, certainly insofar as foreign investment is real and it exists, by chopping it off, there will be a slight decrease in land and property value, and I think that upper middle class, tech workers, labor aristocracy are materially going to benefit by potentially getting access to the housing market, which of course will just create a new layer of demand, and therefore prices will just go right back up. But it's more the myth that is invested by the working class, by the proletariat, by the lumpen proletariat, literally everyone who thinks that they have this possibility of accessing private property on unceded territory. And I think that part of our work is deconstructing that dream and proposing alternatives. And part of that is raising questions about what the public state-owned model has looked like in the past, and recognizing it both as a victory and as a form of social control, and thinking of other forms of collective ownership and self-management, forms of tenant control, forms of tenant-run housing, co-op housing, but also not lapsing into the neoliberal alternative of land trusts in this vague these kind of co-ops or shared equity, which is also kind of fits neatly into the market. So I think that the colonial dynamic forces us to think about something that has never existed, possibly. But yeah, I think the class consciousness, the false consciousness of the masses is very strong around this. And despite the fact that this is pandering to the petty bourgeoisie youth who's moving out of their parents' Point Grey home and is having a hard time, it's also pandering to the working class broadly, and I think that their instinctual scapegoating is very strong, and so really shame on our government, really shame on them for creating a whole generation of people who are going to go to that as their main explanation. It's going to be so much work to undo the harm that the NDP has done. I feel. And something we haven't even talked about, I'll just say really quickly, this is also being wrapped up with ideas of dirty money as a way of basically reinvesting something that one thought was dying, which was the drug war. This public inquiry is now going to be a way of reinvigorating the drug war. The dirty money and the fentanyl crisis is somehow bound up with this, but the rhetoric is essentially just something which we thought was maybe on its last gasp, but which has been given a new breath of life, which is border controls, which is war on drugs, which is war on gangs defined in the most vague and unhelpful way, but gangs essentially meaning racialized working class people. And I think the cracking down on gangs as part of this public inquiry is there's no aspect of this inquiry which is redeemable, I think, in my opinion.
It's a good and difficult question. I don't know what the numbers are here in New York. Renters are about 2/3 of the population, and so that does create a kind of tenant block that could be formed and mobilized that isn't worried about their mortgage and isn't probably thinking that they're going to become homeowners either. I don't know if that's the case here, but that does form 55%. So yeah, you got a majority.
Yeah.
But we have a super majority over there, which changes things a little bit. The settler colonial question is a huge one, and I think it really comes down to what the future of the state is going to be also. I wouldn't give up on public ownership, but we can think about what we mean by public. We can also, which means the state, or it means something else, but we can also think about what we mean by the state. And I think that there's work to be done there in terms of what an anti-colonial and eventually decolonial urban state might mean.
I think maybe we can just start by centering kind of the injustice of the land around the fact that, like, as long as there shouldn't be anybody who's indigenous and homeless on this land. That's like a ridiculous thing. And as long as we keep like asserting how disgusting that is, and also reasserting how much that is, I think, like the primary issue that needs to be solved, hopefully we can start thinking about the rest of it by centering on who this nation did injustice to begin with, and who it's still doing injustices to every single day.
Last question, Sarah?
Can I make a quick comment and another question? It's okay, I'll keep it short.
Sure, we don't have much time.
So, first I want to say thanks so much for this book. I think I like it a lot because it's a Leninist book. And what I mean by that is that it really, like the part where you talk about the contradiction, managing the contradictions within the state, it helps a lot. Like the last 6 months or so, we've been at BT, we've been working very closely with Gene Swanson, who just got elected about 6 months ago, and kind of just like trying to maneuver around like how staff try to block her and like, no, this motion, you can't have it, and this, you have to change the wording here, you're insulting staff here, this is not legal, it has to, so like a lot of those contradictions actually come out in like what you see like right there at the city council meetings and kind of what you get from staff. And there's this one thing, and I want to say like a really good book, in my opinion, is one that for a while after you kind of see the world through the lens that it has, and I was reading these notes from staff, and this is what I want to read from everybody, if that's okay. Very quick. So this motion that Gene Swanson submitting about expanding this program policy for protecting rentals, general all rental buildings to rentals that are in commercially zoned areas that are somehow just neglected. And staff really, really dislikes this. And they say this and that, it has to go through public hearing. It also represents a significant reduction in land value for owners of commercially zoned properties. While staff are not necessarily opposed to downzoning to protect rental housing, an analysis, consideration of consequences, and consultation with owners is needed before making such significant decisions. So I thought this was pretty kind of from staff being like, we're not opposed to this, but like we have a hard time with it. We're not even sure why. Which kind of comes back to your point about managing the property value contradiction. So my question is, you said something very interesting about how we should create a crisis that we can take advantage of. And I think this last part is something we forget a lot. Like we want to create a crisis, we want to make those contradictions harder to manage for the state. But how do we take advantage of them as well? Because to me it seems like there is a crisis right now and it's constantly getting worse, but at the same time the people who are taking the most advantage of have been the sort of the foreign ownership discourse on the one hand and the yimbys on the other hand, who want more and more and more densification, higher property values. And we're sort of in between, kind of getting attacked from both sides. And it seems to me like the only way to really be able to take advantage of this crisis is to have the power to do that, which means seizing the state. I don't know if that was one of the recommendations in your book. But yeah,
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah, it's in there. It's in chapter 5. Among many scenarios. Well, I mean, unless you feel like that seizure is imminent, we need another strategy. We never know. We never know, right? But I guess what I mean by a crisis that we're prepared for is that there might be a lot of like down the line potentialities that are not good for us, right? So like we spark this crisis of the real estate state and the property values start to fall and everything else. That could turn against us very quickly. It could turn against us in terms of the class composition question. If like the upper reaches of the working class are really negatively affected by this, and then we get like the lower end or the tenants get blamed for it, that could lead to a political reaction that's really vicious. It could be what I talked about in that passage that I read out loud, that the state doubles down and says, no, real estate capital, come back. And that's not going to be great either. You know, I'm from New York City, and so we had a political crisis in 1975 that was sparked by a fiscal crisis before that, and the official narrative that got sort of doled out was, this is because the welfare state was too generous. And we've been pushing back against that for like however many years it's been, 40 something. So that's what I mean about creating a crisis that we're ready for, and creating the counter narrative before the crisis even happens, creating the plan for what we would want out of it before it happens. Like, yes, we're in a crisis right now, but one that the state is perfectly willing to manage. So, you know, I think our organizing can maybe spark some of this, the right kind of crisis, but our planning actually has to be around how we survive it.
I feel like it's, I have different feelings about trying to insert movements into the kind of municipal state where I think there's still some kind of semblance of direct democracy that's possible, or at least can be made possible through certain collective actions and through trying to make that a possibility, whereas I at least am like completely skeptical of seizing like, I guess, provincial and federal states, just because the representative democracy hasn't really managed to need the ear of collective action specifically, and I think a lot needs to shift with our movements if that is ever going to happen. I guess I don't really feel like it's like imminent, but there's still a lot of other collective actions that are possible that may also lead to those kinds of transformations, but can kind of impact capital where it is right now, obviously. Like, the strike is still a strike, it's still useful, it still gets things done, it's still transformed and still transforms many things in the States, and we can still do that with rent strikes as well. So I also, I want to like hold a lot of room for a lot of different visions of like what that change of power will like look like, because I certainly don't know the answers, but I also always want to like center it and like that we can take action without the state, and that is like completely a possibility, but we need to do a lot of organizing to get that done.
And I think as we develop organizations, as we develop working class power through organizations, I think we'll be able to articulate, develop those skills, learn how to govern, basically, right? So I think that this conversation is very, forward thinking. I think that the more we organize in organizations, we'll be able to learn those skills and things like that. I'm thinking about like the Communist Party of China, how they, after 1949, they had been in this long protracted war, and they had been basically running their own cities and learn how to be administrators and these types of things. So I think they already had those skills, and they already, planning knowledge around how to organize their cities. So I think that, I don't know, this conversation is kind of weird, but yeah.
Yeah, let's give it up for these guys. So I'm going to close it out a bit with a short little wrap-up, wrap-up exercise, and talk a bit about what's going to happen next. Okay, how many of you guys have gone to a city council meeting? Put up your hands. I'm very sorry, because it sucks. It's really horrible. I don't go anymore. I used to go a lot. I think I've been banned from the building at this point. They know my name. It's very creepy. But we know what happens there, right? You go there, you want to talk about an issue. They're gonna this is like participating in a democracy, right? And you go there, and then they stretch it out. They stretch it out for like hours. They push the thing that's really important that everyone came for to the back, right? Wait for people to leave, right? And make sure that no one is actually there for the actual vote or the conversation. This is how our democracy works, right? It tries to empty the room out, so they're governing over nothing, right? This is like, common theme with the democracy contradiction here, is that like, look, when there's a consultation, you write down your opinion, you put it in a box, and they do whatever they're gonna do anyway. The vote goes in, and it just disappears in the black box. All right, the consultations and the city hall process, we know that these people they get a lot of money, anywhere between 80K to 300K a year just to put us through this process, right? There's something wrong with our democracy, there's something wrong with the political process as it's framed by municipal politics, and that's why we need to think about what they're talking about, class struggle organizing, right? And there's a place for all of us in it. But what does it mean? We need to know what a class is, right? What is class consciousness for tenants, and how do we develop it? If you've ever been in a radical space in Vancouver, you've probably seen this very beautiful poster from the 70s. It's by Pat Smith, made by Press Gang. It says, class consciousness is knowing what side of the fence you're on, and class analysis is knowing who's there with you, right? Today's talk, we figured out a little bit who our enemies are, but we got to also figure out where our power is and how to build it, right? There's a lot of people in this room, very smart people, very people that know a lot of different things. We're all good at different stuff. You don't have to be a Marxist egghead like these guys to be part of the movement. And this is why, the old form of a union, whether it's a tenant union or a worker union, is really important, right? Because it's a whole social sphere. It's a world of mutual aid, of solidarity that we need to redevelop, right? Unions have been busted for over the last half a century, and we need to rebuild those institutions because they're not just about strikes, right? They're about taking care of each other. They're about knowing more than the enemy. And they're about coordinating what is a new kind of society within our own, right? We have to build this new world, as Nat was saying, is that we won't know the answer of what the next world will be until we try organizing it. And that's the key to understanding the folly of the planner, is that they think that from their their office up in Woodwards, that they know how to plan a city and people's lives without ever touching the ground, right? We're on the ground, we know each other, we know a lot of things, but we're just not organized enough yet, right? And we need to figure out how to do that, and it comes from just the on-the-ground work of talking to each other, finding each other. And there's a moment of crisis at the moment, right now, where, there's a pendulum shift, right? Maybe housing prices are coming down, but we have the intuition, we know that rents are never going down. That's historically not a thing that happens, I'm pretty sure. But we have the intuition as workers, right, as tenants, that there's a problem here, right? We work, they profit, right? We pay rent, they profit. There's a calculus here where it seems like we're losing, right? There's that intuition, but there's all these planners, city people, media people that are grasping that intuition and turning it into what? We need more supply, oh, we need more condos, et cetera, et cetera. We need to do more initiatives like this to teach each other, to educate each other, to find each other in order to build a strong movement. And I think this is just the very beginning, right, of a big fight that we all need to be armed for. So who's ready for that? Is everyone ready for that? So what's happening next is Sam unfortunately can't stay too long right now because we have to push him to actually Woodward's building, where he'll be doing a book talk there with SFU. The SFU, the Urban Studies Department and the Geography Department has been kind enough to fly Sam over. But if you'd like to go, we can walk together to the next event. It's just a short book talk. It's 3 minutes away. Or if you want to hang out here, buy a drink, hang out a little bit, talk to each other, that's cool too. But again, thank you everyone for coming here, and thank you to the panel. And thanks, Oh yeah, let me get that.
Sorry, folks, just real quick. Sorry, just one last thing. My name is Maz. I'm on the steering committee for the Vancouver Tenants Union. We're organizing a town hall on the Green New Deal over the weekend. Just real quick, Green New Deal, if you don't know, is a plan to make sure that the climate crisis and the solutions that we come up with it transition in a just and equitable way. And that means in our cities, centering renters and folks who are having insecure housing, and making sure that any plan that we come up with does not leave them behind, does not create displacement. So we're putting together a town hall. We want to hear from everybody to contribute to that plan. That's Saturday at 5 p.m. at the Carnegie Center in the theater there. So please join us, Saturday at 5. Thank you.